To get our player's true value, we must first calculate the baseline replacement player at the same position. You will find various ways to do this on the internet, but where I have found the most success is by using the number of players drafted at each position up to a given point in the draft. This is something that I borrowed from the guys at fantasyfootballanalytics.com. Using our baseline, we can better value each player by measuring how much better or worse we expect that player to perform when measured against the baseline player at the same position. First, let's read in a data frame with our If we look at the number of teams in a league and the number of starting positions, we can use that at the cutoff pick to find who our baseline player is. I found it to work best using previous year's draft information, so in my case, I've dropped last year's picks into a CSV and I can calculate the number of positions drafted by a certain pick. So here, let's read in our data frame, and again, I have a CSV with my last year's draft information. And if we look at the head of this data frame, you'll see I have them in the pick order, the player, and the position. Since I was in a 10-person team league and we had 8 starting positions, I'm going to use 80 as the cutoff point for our average starter. This means I can create a new data frame, df top 80, that equals just the first 80 picks of the draft. This means I can filter that draft df to only give me the rows where the pick was less than or equal to 80. So if I say draft df and I get the pick is less than or equal to 80, and then I want to put this in brackets, and I can save this as the df top 80. And now, if we just look here at the tail, we're going to have the last 5 picks in the draft up to 80. Then we can use our group by method to group by the position and count the number of players at each position in this new data frame we created. So if I take the data frame, df top 80, and I group by the position, and then I take the count, we could see that there were 15 centers chosen, 19 power forwards, 21 point guards, 12 small forwards, and 13 shooting guards in the first 80 picks. Let's turn this into a position dictionary, which we can reference later in a for loop. So if I basically say position dictionary, and then here what I'm going to want to do is say at the point guard, we have 21, shooting guard 13, shooting guard 13, and then the same for the last 3 positions. From here, we are going to read in 2 other CSV files that has the ESPN player positions for each of the players we have projected points for, and our actual projected points, CSV, which we will use to merge. So again, I have a CSV file that has my ESPN player positions, and then we're also going to read in our CSV file that has our projected points. Now, if we just look at the sample of both of these, you'll see we have the player ID and the season ID for each. So let's just use the player ID to merge. So we can merge on the player ID by saying this new data frame will equal the df1 merge, and we want to merge df2, and how it's going to be a left join, and on is going to be player ID. Now we can run this. So we're going to create a new data frame, df3, which is really just taking df1, merging df2, how equals left, which is like a left join in SQL, and on, it's going to be on the player ID. And now we can run this. And then let's just pull the columns we currently care about. Keep in mind that since player name and season ID were duplicated, it's going to add a default _x and _y to the left and right columns on the merge. This means we can just take the x, the _x, and rename it. So if we go to our df3, what we care about now, the column names, is we want the player name, again, that it's going to have the _x on it. We want the player ID. We want the season ID, and again, since that one's duplicated, it's also going to have an X. We want the ESPN position, and we want our fantasy points. And we can save this as a df final. And then we're just going to want to rename the columns with that X to drop it to make it look nicer. And great, you'll see now we have our player name, our player ID, our season ID, and now we have this new ESPN position and then our projected fantasy points. Let's save this as a CSV file so we can use it in our Google Sheets later. We can do this by using our toCSV method and making sure we store it in the right location. And again, we don't need the index, so we'll set that equal to false. All right, let's create a position list with all of our positions. This will help us in a for loop. So within that, we have our PG. Let's create a positions list with all of our positions. This will help us in a for loop. So we have our PG, our SG, our SF, our PF, and our center. And now we can define a baseline function that does the following. Filters our data frame to only show rows with this certain position, calls our position dictionary to get the value for the given position, locates the player row within our data frame based on that dictionary value, and gets the projected fantasy points for that player to save into a variable. So we'll call this our calc baseline, and it's going to take a position and a data frame. And it's going to return some value to subtract. And so again, if we first want to get the rows where the ESPN position is equal to some position that we're passing it, and then here we know this is only going to return a Boolean of true or false. So let's add in the df to it. And again, to make it simple, let's save this to a new df filter. So if we pass in point card, this is going to filter our original data frame, or the data frame we pass it, on all the rows where it's equal to point card, and save that into a new data frame. And then from here, we want to use that position dictionary that we defined earlier and get the value based on the key, which will be the position. Make sure this is spelled right. And we could save that into X. So what this is going to do is based on that position, it's going to get the value associated with the key. So if we pass in the power forward, it's going to get us the value 19. So now that we have that value, which would be 19, meaning we want the 19th player in the data frame for that position, we can then filter using our iLock method and passing it in X. And so here, let's say we had that 13th position, we are now going to filter and get the row for the 13th. We have that 13th position, we are going to get the row, the 13th row in that filtered data frame. And here we can save this as a replacement player, since it's going to just return a row of the replacement player. But ultimately what we want there is just that replacement player's fantasy points. And here is what we will save it as that value to subtract. So again, we are filtering based on a position. We're getting the value associated with that key from our positions dictionary. We are then identifying that row with our iLock method to get the replacement player, and then getting our replacement player's fantasy points and returning that value. And so what we can do is now loop over each position to get our baseline fantasy points for each position. So if we have our baseline points as an empty dictionary, we can write for position in positions, which is this list. And what we want is to calc the baseline for the position and passing in the df final, which is what we created earlier. Let's save this as a variable y. And then let's add a new key value pair of adding to that dictionary the position and the value associated with that position. And if we run this, and if we run this, and if we run this, and then print our baseline points, we now have the baseline number for each position. Great. We will move over to our Google Sheets for our final steps. Great. We'll now move over to Google Sheets for our final steps to help with our draft preparation.